Well, Jacob is on the move. God has called upon him to head back to the land of his ancestors. And for the first time in a very long time, Jacob is headed home. It was a complicated departure from his father-in-law Laban, but I'll let you read on your own to fill in those gaps. What's important to remember in our story today is that the reason Jacob left his home in the first place, if you recall, his brother Esau was threatening to kill him. Because Jacob had swindled Esau out of his birthright and tricked their father Isaac to get the blessing that was rightfully Esau's. No doubt Esau's entire life, his entire inheritance, had been affected and taken away by Jacob's underhanded manipulations. And now Jacob is headed back toward that same brother. That same brother he deeply betrayed some 20 years ago. Understandably, Jacob is pretty nervous. He sends messengers out ahead of his caravan with tremendous gifts to offer his brother Esau, hoping Esau will not kill them all the moment that Esau learns they are near. And the messengers go, and they return, and they tell Jacob, "Your brother Esau is coming, and he's bringing 400 men." Well, as one might imagine, in a moment like this, Jacob falls to his knees in prayer, praying to the God who has not failed him yet, asking God to deliver him from the wrath of his brother Esau. A story we will hear more about next week. But for now, Jacob is trembling in his boots on the banks of the river Jabbok, unsure if he will live to see another day or if his brother will slaughter them all in their sleep. Jacob ensures that his wives and children and livestock and everything he owns makes its way across the Jabbok, and he stays alone on the other side. And then a man wrestled with him till daybreak. The details are sketchy, which is why so many questions have been asked of this text over the years. But the match continues throughout the night. As dawn is breaking, the anonymous assailant takes what some might call a cheap shot, dislocates Jacob's hip. Jacob, likely writhing in pain, is injured but will not let go of his attacker. The assailant cries, "Let me go, for day is breaking." "Not until you bless me," Jacob replies. The stranger asks for Jacob's name. Jacob tells him, and then the stranger says, "Not anymore. Your name is no longer Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Jacob asks the man for his name. The stranger declines, but then the stranger offers a blessing upon Jacob and disappears into the breaking dawn. The sun rises upon this new man named Israel, and from that moment on, Jacob, now Israel, is never the same. He has the limp, and he has the name to prove it. Now, let me assure you, if this story fills you with more questions than answers, you are not alone. It is a story filled with mystery, a story that biblical scholars have wrestled with, pun intended, for centuries. A story so profoundly odd that we are left scratching our heads on the banks of the Jabbok, watching Jacob, now Israel, limp off into the distance. The identity of this mysterious attacker is often one of the most contentious points in the story. Commentators have suggested all kinds of solutions or explanations over the years. Some say the man is Jacob's greatest fear and rival, his brother, come to him disguised in the dark for vengeance. Others have suggested it is Jacob's own inner demons that have come calling, a past catching up with him. Verses 28 and 31 shed some light on the direction I'm inclined to go with this text. In verse 28, this stranger gives Jacob a new name in the midst of their wrestling match. Israel, which literally means prevails with God, might make us think God is at work in this match. And then in verse 31, this suspicion that in fact it is God is confirmed by Jacob in the text. When after the stranger has disappeared, Jacob proclaims, I have seen God face to face, and I have lived to tell about it. And yet, even if we are settled, even if we feel like, okay, this is God, rather than clearing the story up when we place an identity upon this stranger, this point actually only creates more questions. Well, if the stranger is God, how could Jacob possibly beat God? Isn't God all powerful? And why the wrestling match to begin with? Is God testing Jacob's character or faith? I mean, why is God attacking Jacob? Whatever the reason for the attack, Jacob's response is to stand his ground, to struggle with this attacker. In many ways, this is not a new response from Jacob. As we've learned, Jacob has been wrestling with someone his whole life. It began in the womb with his twin Esau, and then he manipulated and tricked his way through childhood, even into adulthood, and here he is again on the banks of the Jabbok, wrestling once more. Only this time, it is a little different. Jacob does not flee from the match. He does not cheat or trick. He fights. He wrestles. And when he doesn't have any fight left in him, he holds on for dear life. I often wonder if Jacob knew that he was wrestling with God that night. Did he know it at the beginning, or halfway through, or only after the fight was finished? We will never know. But God knew. God knew from the beginning. God sought Jacob out on the banks of the Jabbok that night. God invited the wrestling match, and God wrestled Jacob until dawn. I imagine God could have pinned Jacob in a nanosecond if God wanted to. But God allowed Jacob to prevail. God stayed on the mat with Jacob all night long. I imagine God had other things to do in the world that night, but God chose to spend time wrestling with a fearful and vulnerable man. I imagine God didn't need to come to Jacob in this tangible human form, but chose the intimacy of this personal encounter over and above any impersonal interaction that God could have created. What a beautiful insight into the character of God. This story reveals that the God of Israel is not an impersonal being or a terrifying presence that Jacob can't relate to in any meaningful way. God does not expect or demand only praise and groveling from Jacob. Rather, God is ready and willing and eager to stand on the mat with Jacob and say, "Hit me with your best shot, because I can take it. I am here with you for the fight." And Jacob does not protect God. Did you notice Jacob does not flee from this fight? Jacob does not fall on his face and grovel. Jacob does not stop and wonder what this will mean about God at the end of the day. Jacob fights. And when Jacob doesn't have any fight left in him, he holds on for dear life. And when Jacob holds on for dear life, he is changed forever. I can remember a time or two in my life when I've been wrestling with God. Wrestling with who God is or how God could allow things to happen in this world. I can remember times in my life when that wrestling has been encouraged by the community around me. I can remember times when it hasn't. I imagine I'm not alone. I can remember a time or two in my life when the rug has been pulled out from under me and I was filled with so much anger or rage or pain or grief or doubt that all I could do was hold on for dear life. And I imagine I'm not alone in that either. A few years ago, I attended the funeral of a woman who had died from a rare form of cancer at age 31, leaving behind a husband and 2 children. And as I was leaving the funeral that day, I overheard the woman's mother talking with a friend. The friend asked her, "How are you holding up?" And the mother, who had just buried her daughter, replied, "God is faithful, God is good, and this was God's will. So I will rejoice in the Lord always." I burst into tears as I left the funeral that day. Yes, for the woman who had died, but even more for her mother. A woman who did not seem to know the God that I know. A God who is good and faithful, yes, but a God who will meet us on the mat called life and wrestle with us till dawn. Give me all you've got. I can take it. Your doubts, your fears, your angers and questions, your cursing and screaming, your weeping and wailing, your loneliness and darkness. Come on, hit me with all you've got, because I am your God and I can take it, and I am not going anywhere. I will stay here with you as long as it takes. I will be faithful to you when you're ready to fight, and I will be faithful to you when you are holding on for dear life. This is the God we meet on the banks of the river Jabbok. The God who called Jacob Israel and wrestled with him till dawn. And as Nathan Asang reminds us, we are the spiritual descendants of Jacob, of Israel. We are the people who wrestle with God. It is not presumptuous of us to make this claim. God was the one who gave that name to God's people. That's who God desires for us to be. Of course, God could squash us like a bug, but for our benefit. God is always available to wrestle with us at whatever level we are capable of wrestling. We may come away with elbow burns or with a limp. After all, we always carry the scars of our struggles with mystery. Wrestling with God always comes with a cost, because it always changes us. Sometimes in frightening ways. Hearts are molded unexpectedly. Views and attitudes get changed forever, even those we cling to so tightly. Some of our wrestling will be uncomfortable. Some of it may feel like a dark night of the soul. And some of it will surprise us beyond our wildest imaginings. But if we're willing to step into the ring with God, we won't be the same afterward. And God will stay on that mat with us as long as it takes. As long as it takes for us to understand the fullness of God's love. A blessing the likes of which we could never fully understand, but a blessing nonetheless. A number of years ago, there was an article written in Our Iowa magazine about a wrestling match between Ogden and Humboldt high schools. The Humboldt wrestling team had a senior on their team with Down syndrome. He wasn't capable of wrestling at a competitive level. He posed no challenge to any wrestler he might face. But knowing how much this team meant to this young man, his coach reached out to their next competitor, Ogden High School, asking if the Ogden team had anyone who would be willing to wrestle the young man at the meet, giving him a chance just to get out on the mat. A student on the Ogden team volunteered. And the Ogden student not only wrestled the young man, he wrestled with him for the full 6 minutes, allowing the Humboldt senior to score points and ultimately to beat him. At the end of the match, the official raised the Humboldt senior's arm in victory, and the senior looked at the referee in disbelief. "I won?" It was one of the most thrilling moments of his young life. And the crowd rose to their feet in applause. God isn't wrestling with you to win. God is wrestling with you that you might be transformed in the wrestling, ultimately knowing the thrill and the abundance of God's blessing. A blessing you may never know or understand or embrace until you have held on for dear life through the darkest nights that life has to offer. But rest assured, God will meet you in that darkness. God will find you alone in that darkness. And God will call upon you as God called upon Jacob. Hit me with all you've got, because I can take it. For I am the Lord your God, and I'm not going anywhere. Thanks be to God. Amen.